Welcome. I'm Chase Hagood. This is Together, a higher ed podcast at the University of Utah. Today we're joined by really a good friend, an innovator, a leader, a higher ed evangelist, somebody who has done really amazing work. And so on this podcast, we're looking for those folks who have led change, who have innovated and done it in some really powerful ways. Today we're joined by Joshua Sine, or Josh Sine, as I know him. Josh, welcome. We're glad that you're here.
Thanks for having me, Chase. I'm thrilled to be a part of the conversation. So thanks for bringing me in.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting time, right? Higher ed is facing all sorts of changes and transformations. And I think knowing your work and knowing you, I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how, from your perspective, how data, big, right, small, medium, whatever, how has it been and how can it be effectively leveraged for us to think about the kind of meaningful change that so many are looking for and so many are demanding right now of higher education?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that data is can be just a word at times that we throw around on institutions, and we want to be data driven. We want to leverage data to make decisions. We want to use data to inform the paths we're going to follow, to identify trends, and so when we think about big data and we think about the opportunity that it gives us to better understand, what I think is most important is individuals. Mm-hmm. And a data set is really just something that's comprised of a series of actions or interactions. And when we boil it down to its very foundational stage, it's a human. It's a student. It's an interaction. It's an engagement. At least that's the way I've taken my approach to data. And working with institutions all over the world, tried to help shape that data is really built through an interactive form. And if we look at it as just information that sort of segments populations or gives us some kind of directional focus or emphasis, then we're not getting to the meat of data. So when I think about data, I think about people. I think about, particularly in higher education, I think about students, because that's a lot of the data that we're using to better inform how we support. And historically, data has been leveraged in a operational manner, meaning we want to know when students were somewhere and what they did. So thinking about systems of operation that give us visibility into kind of the actions that those students are taking. But the way that I like to think about data is built off of three main pillars, right? Giving our interactions with students, giving them the ability to shape our future engagements through these three pillars. Number one, being able to listen, and listening in a way that isn't just about when and what, but why and how and behavioral. And so giving us that framework to then understand and use data to analyze, better understand those behaviors, better understand those engagements and those moving parts of our institution. And then lastly, to act. And these acting in a way that isn't passive, but uses both historical interaction data and real-time feedback and voice of the student to engage throughout a journey that supports student success, that supports the individual and personalization at scale. And, as I start to think about institutions and organizations that are using data to do that, you start to see a real change in the behaviors of those students and of those institutions in a really productive way.
Yeah. Well, so in that, I think knowing you and knowing your work across a really vast kind of landscape of, from international to data to, the way that technology and structures can impact how we go about the work, and the way that you've described just now, leveraging data, not just on the collection side, not just on the analysis side, but how it promotes action, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk through a couple of strategies or decisions, from your vantage point in the multiple kind of positions that you've been in, to think about institutions of higher ed and how how we can go about, setting off kind of cycles of innovation or creating change, both in the short term where we see these immediate impacts, and where right now it seems a lot of folks are saying we want to see, results right now, right? A lot of conversations about ROI and the like, but, not only in the short term though, right? For the long term.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be where we see it pay off, right? For, as you point out, students, right? It's not, we don't measure, well, we do in some instances measure like retention or persistence term to term, but like the 4, the 5, the 6-year graduation, the lifetime, right, of learning, or the lifetime of joy, right, and of fulfillment that we hope that higher education can play a part in. So some strategies, if you can think of some.
Yeah, and I just to build on what you were saying around the lifetime relationship, I mean, remembering my experience as a student, the organizations that I chose to study with, like I wanted that kind of relationship, right? Like I wanted them to know me, I wanted to know them. It wasn't a situation where I didn't feel involved or engaged because of my own lack of interest. And I think there's a gap there sometimes in understanding on campus when we see students aren't participating or they're not involving themselves. And a lot of times, I use the collective we look at the student to blame, right? And say, for whatever reason, they're not coming to this activity, they're not participating in course evaluations. And a lot of that stems from them not feeling like their voice is valued and that their voice is heard, right? And so like when we think about, and I'll get to the strategies in just a minute, but this to me is really foundational. When we look at the foundational point of why students become disengaged, there's a multitude of reasons as to what that is. But on some level, 3 things were really impacted. And to get back engaged, we have to focus on those 3 things. And number 1 is effort. So if we're really looking for student voice and we're looking to contact and stay engaged with students, it has to be somewhat low effort for them. And we may look at that and say, well, institutionally, like our responsibility is to keep them accountable and show them, how to check the boxes so that they can get gainfully employed.
Sure.
When in reality, some of the things that we're asking them to do or some of the areas where we can support them could be much lower effort to engage them in the process, because we don't know everything that's going on in their day-to-day life. And so as we start to think about that engagement, it's got to be low effort. Number 2 is it's got to be personalized. So it's got to be about them or something that they've participated in. If we reach out to them with a generalized survey or a generalized form or something that isn't relevant to their experience, then that's another demonstration that we don't know who they are. And a lot of institutional leaders I talk to, they're concerned about privacy and whether students are going to feel like big brother's leaning in. And the truth is, when I've been a part of outreach and surveys, massive surveys to thousands and thousands of students are surprised that institutions are not using that information that they share during the admissions process and throughout to better personalize that engagement, right? And so, during the admissions process, we basically get everything they would give to a loan processor for their first mortgage, right?
Yep.
And maybe more so in the terms of letters of recommendations and things along those lines. And so that ability to personalize is there. It's just the infrastructure may not always exist on campus. And so And the awareness that like students are used to this type of engagement in their interactions, and they play many roles with us. They're not just a student. They're, I hate to use the word customer, but they are a consumer of our services, of our goods, of our instruction, and they play a role of mentee in the classroom. And so, the more that we understand their individual focus and experience. And that's through that personalization element. And the last thing is responsiveness, right? Like when students open up to us and share their feelings and their experiences or provide feedback or have a negative response to something, like we have to in turn respond. And that doesn't mean that, we hear from them they want chocolate milk in the drinking fountains. That's beside the point. That is engaging dialogue. And that's, in my mind, as I work across the world, that's what students want. They want to be engaged in the dialogue. They want to know that if you're reaching out, or if you're asking for feedback through a course evaluation, or if you're seeking their approval of something, that matters, and that it matters in a way that they'll continue that dialogue. Soon as they feel that break in communication, that the information that they provided isn't informing the decisions that you're making, then that's where like the fatigue comes in, which is like, my institution isn't listening and doesn't know me. So that's kind of foundationally, like, just to lay that out in terms of strategies where, data has been leveraged, or institutions have found ways to support the overall student journey. Technology is a big piece of that. And but it's not technology that isn't human-centered, right? We have to think about high tech that drives high touch. Because when we think about the institutional experience, there are several layers in which we can get lost, from our admissions processes to financial aid applications, and FAFSA complicated that even more this past year, to applying for a major, to meeting with their advisors. Like, there's levels of complexity within there that are extremely challenging, and that students, you can get lost in the web of services. And if we think that a technology is just going to come in and replace those humans in those offices, that's not going to take place. Like, that can't happen. That said, in order to scale at the level at which students are needing support, and on every other aspect of their life are getting that support, technology has to be a piece of that. And so as we start to think about that technology infrastructure, we have to start to think about, technologies that drive connectivity through what is a disaggregated system of systems, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And when you think about that on a granular level, like, we have a ton of systems that do really good things, but those things alone. So you think about your student information system, or you think about your learning management system, and those two work together on some level. But in reality, the data that feeds from those things aren't always connected. And we think about the journeys that our students take, and being able to support those journeys as a holistic journey, rather than admissions department oversees that, financial aid department oversees that, academic advising is filling in that gap, right? We have to look at that holistic journey as tethered together. And so when we think about our technology, we have to think about technologies that are able to work together. And I think there are really four big areas for technology. Obviously, you have your student information system, and we see big players in that space making big changes. In tied in with some student success initiatives and things along those lines. And then, of course, you have your learning management systems, which are critical and can be more action-oriented if combined with other areas. Then, of course, as an institution, you have your HRIS, right? Your system of record for your human resources. And then I think there's another layer that's got to come in, and the corporate world is adopting this as they've along with the HRIS is your CRM, so sort of like your front end operational systems. But then the layer that I'm leaning towards is this idea of like experience management, and being able to look at not just the operational data points, and not just checking the boxes of when students registered, or why they how they registered, but why they registered and how that registration experience was. And so the institutions that I see that are making the biggest change are focused on this kind of closed loop, action-oriented focus that gives you the ability to, like I said, listen, understand, and act at 30,000 feet from a continuous improvement standpoint, analyzing like the friction points along the journey, but also at the individual student level, individual stakeholder level, individual employee level, and be able to intervene and support those folks in the journey, because that's what it is. And I think to start, those are areas of opportunity, and there's a lot of innovation in that space right now.
Yeah, I'm interested to follow up because as you talk about the personalization, you talk about like for any large institution, organization, right? It seems to me, and this was years ago, that somebody said to me like, well, and in fact, it was a former student at another institution said to me like, yeah, what really turned me off was that every time I opened an email that was asking me something about my experience, I was asked by, this institution what my name is, what my major is, what my,
Right.
and these are all things from the user perspective, in this case, a student, is assuming that the organization, the institution, and we have this information.
All of it.
So why is it that you continue to ask me things about me as if I'm unknown to you?
Yeah.
And I mean, that left a mark, because it was like,
Totally.
with me, because it's like, why are we doing that every time we turn around?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, imagine if you had just taken a flight and they sent you a survey asking how your flight was, but they required you to put in all of the information, right? Like, what flight were you on, and do you remember your pilot's name,
Right?
And who was the flight attendant that helped you?
Right.
And you would be appalled. Like, here I am, a loyal whatever member you are of the program for that airline, and they don't know anything about you. Yet that same attitude and behavior we take towards a student, even with like a course evaluation or a feedback that's like, hey, how was your experience in classes, right? Like, not even like this class or for this particular experience, or hey, we saw you attended a football game. Did you enjoy it, right? It's very depersonalized, simply because the investment in technologies haven't been around like the experience focus. It's been on, how do we create moments of opportunity for dialogue so that we can see sort of that students are participating, but when it comes down to the personalization level, the argument that's always been made historically, always is a hyperbole, but that is made often, is like, well, we want students to respond anonymously. And it's like, well, students don't want to be anonymous. They don't want to be anonymous. They want to know that you know them. They want to know that when they come in for services, that anything they've shared with you before can be used as a way to better serve them.
Right.
Better help understand their experience. And at the end of the day, that's humanizing, as opposed to what we've heard historically in higher ed, which is like, I just feel like a number, right? You've got 40,000 students or 35,000 students. How do you make each one of those students feel like they belong, they matter, that that their opinions are heard, and that the dialogue that they're hoping to continues? And to say that you can do that human by human is really challenging. But that's where, Chase, I think the investment in technology that leverages those capabilities, and we see it in every other industry. Education is just a late adopter. Mm-hmm. And, having worked in the tech sector, right, like the common theme is like, well, education is just 10 years behind. And it's like, well, the truth is our institutions are leading innovation when it comes to research across every industry you can think of, right? Like when the corporate world wants a case study, who do they go to do it, right? They come to academics. And so this idea that we as higher ed institutions are behind, I think is misshaped. It's maybe we have not taken full advantage of the investment in technologies that build relationships with students, because we have taken those relationships for granted, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. And you're seeing institutions that are suffering because of that. But you also see institutions that have invested, that are staying afloat, and that have changed the narrative, and that have incorporated this idea of student success as a mission. And they're getting over internal fights and siloed data, and some of the challenges that we face on campus historically, which is just sort of like a back and forth of egos. And they're putting the student at the center, and they're using that as the glue amidst departments to be able to support that holistic journey.
Yeah. In that space, I think, and again, I'm just really grateful for the conversation. And I mean that sincerely, because I think
appreciate the opportunity.
The perspective that you bring to it, Josh, is like from where you sit now and where you have been. I think where you see projects or initiatives kind of in play, that really have the potential not only to like personalize and say, for an institution to say like, no, we know who not just our students, but who our staff are and our faculty are, and that to be far more kind of people or human kind of oriented in the work that it's doing, but to think about excitement, right? And I like to talk a lot about joy as well. Like, Where do you see those things happening? And you don't have to name institutions, but you could talk about projects. You could think about like, where is it, or as you look at it, you're kind of like, that's amazing. What they're doing over there, like nobody's really done it that way. Or people have tried it and they failed, and that's great too, but they failed and these folks are trying it a different kind of way.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And a lot of experiences pop to mind. I think one of the areas I'm really passionate about is international education. And you mentioned I spent some time in there. And so working to see there's still joy in students coming to the U.S. to study, right? There is families across the world that are willing to, leverage the farm, legitimately to send their child to come and study in the U.S. because they see it as an opportunity. And it's not in a vein of like, we have to do this, but it's like, this is what's best for the future of our family. And the joy when they arrive. And I've worked with organizations that help to support that transition, and seeing students, and personally picked up students from the airport myself, to provide that personalized engagement and to guide them through the decision-making process. And, it's a population that a lot of institutions don't fully comprehend, like the amount of effort that it takes to get here, right? And so for some of the institutions and organizations that I've worked with in the past to invest together in collaborative partnership around bringing and supporting students transitioning from across the globe to a place like the University of Utah or to institutions around the U.S. It's really heartwarming to see, and the difference is the investment in people and individuals as opposed to just processes, right? So it's like there's an admissions process, and that's great, but there is so many layers in between the application and getting a visa and then arriving on the ground. And so taking that full journey into consideration, there's 1 million international students that arrived within the past couple of weeks. And so I think that focus and that emphasis from institutions is heartwarming for me. And I see a lot of potential there as well. And it's a growth area for our U.S.-based institutions because we all know the enrollment cliff is coming and the decline in birth rates in 2008. And so the opportunity to diversify our domestic student experience with international populations that are eager to be here is exciting, and I think an area of opportunity for higher ed. I think another area where I've seen a lot of focus is on the idea of valuing each interaction. And what I mean by that is a lot of our institutions have call center interactions with their students, right? So something breaks, and really the call center or the front desk when a student calls in, that's where dreams go to die. Because, like, let's be honest, nobody wants to call if they don't have to. They're going to go to the website. They're going to go and try to source that information anywhere they possibly can.
Find a chat bot, whatever.
Anything that will give them some layer of support. And so when they have to pick up the phone and make that call, it's challenging on two sides, right? Think about the student experience. They couldn't find the information they want. They couldn't log into their portal, like whatever it might be. But then number two, think about that employee experience who is talking to a frustrated student every time they pick up the phone, right? And many times that's a frustrated student who's been transferred maybe 1 or 2 or 3 times. And so some of the innovation I've seen around this is this idea of one stop. And it's not a new idea, but it's taking those interactions, recording them. So recording the phone calls that happen as a way to support 2 things: better training for the staff, and number 2, to identify friction points that are common, that are interrupting the journey for students in a way that we can leverage technology to tell us so that we can support removing that friction. And the institutions that I've seen do this have found success for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're able to reduce the volume of calls that come in because they're able to change and update the websites that the students are visiting, trying to get the answers to their information. So understanding that digital experience and that digital journey is a major component of our interactions with students. It's like their first place they go, right? And so making sure that we can reduce the friction points there and use that recording as a way to better understand. And number two, they found that rather than it being, well, let me frame this contextually. The institutions that I've worked with historically, like they were afraid of recording their phone calls. Privacy was one of those things, but we are recorded whether we know it or not by Alexa and I probably shouldn't name brands. You may have to drop that out, Robbie.
That's
Sorry.
okay. I mean, I was going to say Siri. And then watch my phone light up.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I mean, like we're being recorded, and whether we like it or not, but that doesn't mean that we have to for students. So that's one of the main issues is like, hey, well, maybe students might not like their phone calls being recorded, but we're able to work through that just based off of the service level that students expect.
Yep.
And then, number two, they're afraid that faculty or staff members may be called out for not doing their work, and that might be used as a stick to beat with as opposed to like a carrot to motivate. And so there's just concern around like the distribution of that recording and how that'll be utilized. And so what was really exciting with the first 4 or 5 institutions that I worked with that adopted some of this technology was they saw more positive feedback for faculty and staff than they did in any of the written evaluation that they took. And so they were able to take that unstructured data, which we have no value for unless we know it's there and or unless we're using it, and use that as a way to build a better way to reward and recognize employees.
Yep.
Which is awesome because typically if you're going to recognize an employee, it's forced through a course evaluation or something along those lines, and they were finding ways to do this organically, which I thought was a really, really cool way to do it. And then number two, as far as the benefits, is employees were able to identify room for growth, professional development, and support. And at the end of the day, they were able to take interactions that are already happening and use those as a means to close the loop for the student. But number two, be able to use that as a way to build a further back-end knowledge of the challenges students are facing, the motivations that are driving them, analyze sentiment and emotion and effort and all of those things to tell a better, more holistic story of both their staff member and their student journey, which to me is like is the way that technology is supposed to be sort of facilitating our institutions.
So I want to follow up on one quick point
Yeah.
and reframe a kind of question, because what I heard because I think that you're spot on when it comes to what drives or limits our ability as organizations or institutions to think about innovation. I'm going to put a pin there, but I want to circle back. I was in a conversation about a month and a half, 2 months ago now, with an individual who was saying, and this gets to your point about international, and their thought was, and this is going to link up to what I think is driving some limitations, and I'll just go ahead and say it, it's fear. But the way that we kind of tell our story, right, higher ed writ large in America right now, which is in a really interesting kind of moment, I think, post-pandemic, politics, etc. No matter where you are in the country, blue state, red state, purple state, doesn't really matter. So the conversation went something like this. And this is a pretty prominent higher ed leader. I'll leave their name out because they wouldn't like it to be included, I'm sure. Because what I'm about to share is that over the course of the conversation, their thinking was, well, American higher education is really broken. It's just dramatically broken. And they would go on to say, what we really need to be thinking about are, shortened degrees and other kinds of credentials, skilling up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying that I disagree with any of that, but they would go on to say, and this connects to international, that, the rest of the world is pursuing higher ed, in the rest of the world is pursuing innovation in all these other different kinds of ways, shortened degrees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, as a historian, I had to kind of push back and say, like, you seem to be casting American higher education as this thing that the rest of the world sees no value in, sees no relevance in. And yet, post World War II, the rest of the world seems to very much want to be coming to American higher education, to your point just now. And it seems like a space for us to be leaning into, not just seeing students come physically to the United States and to American higher ed, but being out in the rest of the world as well, with any number of kind of interventions or innovations, physically located in the rest of the world, through online, et cetera. So if I use that as the kind of stand-in, that kind of seeing or perceiving higher ed, I mean, from that and from your other experiences, you draw on, like, what holds us back? Like, is it just a misunderstanding of where we've been and where we are, and then not creative thinking and or curiosity that could lead us into this next space, and level up who we are and what we do and how we do it? I mean, what do you think? I mean,
it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a layered question too, for sure. And I think some of the challenges we face are legacy, right? So history can be our friend, but it can also kind of cement us in a way of thought or a way of action. And I think part of the challenge we face in higher ed is kind of the Chicken Little notion, right? Which is like the sky is falling, and it's like, well, the sky is there. It hasn't fallen yet. I do think higher ed has some evolving to do, and I think part of the reason we're not evolving fast enough is fear driven, and I think the other challenge we face from an investment standpoint is, where does our dollar come from, right? And lots of times for state institutions, it's complicated. For private institutions, they have a little bit more flexibility because they don't have some of the layers of bureaucracy that a state institution might. But when it comes to our ability to engage internationally, I think it's the unknown. I think there are some really smart people on our campuses that have experience internationally, that are trying to drive relationships and partnerships that can be really fruitful. But it's not always, there isn't always market signal, right? And something institutions are leery of is investing in an area of the institution. I almost used the word business, but of the institution that might put us at risk. And, ironically, in every one of our business courses on campuses, they talk about taking risk and being fearless and being willing to support. And that's the area where higher ed has, I think, been hamstrung, is risk. And so whether it's micro-credentials or whether it's campuses internationally, or whether it's opening up the border so more international students can come when it comes to visa acquisition and things along those lines, I think the risk isn't fully evaluated. Sure. And so it's seen as a risk more than an opportunity. And I think that's a mindset. That's just a culture, right? It's this idea of identifying joy versus seeking challenges, right? And it's how we perceive. But what I can tell you, having traveled the globe and met with thousands of students, there is still a desire to study in the U.S. They see the U.S. higher ed institution as a lever to their potential, to reaching their dreams, to work opportunities, to supporting their families. And, whether that's digitally through distance education, that's definitely an opportunity. Whether that's a campus in a country, that's another opportunity. But coming to the U.S. and living the college experience from an undergraduate or graduate perspective still carries a lot of weight around the world. The challenge we face sometimes is we're pricing ourselves out of that game in terms of the overall price, and that's another conversation for another day. But I think the fear of failing and the risk as being seen of sort of opening the doors is really what's holding us back. And I think it's just a culture and a mindset change. And there are organizations out there that are trying willfully to do that, but it's a full education focus from institutional level to federal level to the state level, understanding that the international world is ready to come study with us. We just have to be ready to let them in.
Awesome. So final question.
Okay.
How can we create lasting, transformative change together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I go back to what I kind of started with, which was this idea of listening. And I think the challenge we've faced historically is that our institutions are very hierarchical, and change comes from the top down, not from the bottom up. And historically, our students' voice hasn't been used as a unifying mechanism. It's seen as us versus them, or the administration versus the students. And so I think the real gap in all of that is just the ability to listen, validate. It's the same framework I talked about: listen, understand, and then act. Mm-hmm. And I think building transformative change comes with folks being open to discussion, to dialogue, the smartest people in the room sitting back and letting everyone have a voice, and combining efforts in a way that is meaningful and centered. And the question wasn't like what transformative change in higher education, but that's where I'm going, because that's where my mind's at. Has to be centered on the student, mm-hmm. right? And that might seem cliche or trite, altruistic, but institutions aren't here without students. If there wasn't somebody that wanted to learn, there'd be a lot of doors shuttered, and we're seeing doors shuttered. And I think the challenges that we face need to be faced together. I think the competitive landscape of higher education needs to be less competitive and more focused on best practice sharing and supporting. And I think that starts with listening. And so if I had to make a proposition, we're one of the only countries that doesn't have a higher education leading body federally, right? We have the Department of Education, but there's nobody who oversees all of the decisions of facing higher education. We have accrediting boards that are disparate and bifurcated and run their own processes. And so for real transformative change for higher education, we need a unification of voices, and we need an organization that helps to facilitate and support and lobby and leverage and engage federally or from an institution combined level. And there's a lot of associations that are making this push around innovation in particular and around alliances, but I think it just has to be on a broader scale. And I think that starts with listening.
Awesome. Josh, thanks for spending some time with us. Really insightful and inspiring thoughts. So sincerely thank you for that. Join us next time together, a higher ed podcast at the University of Utah.